Hey everyone! Welcome to the Worn Shoes Podcast. My name is Zachary, and I interview people that have grown up around the world and learn about the extraordinary in their everyday lives. Today I talk with Davy, who grew up in the UK, China, and the United States. We talk about his family and parents and the hardships they went through together. I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hey Davy, thanks for being on the Worn Shoes Podcast. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah.
Excited to have a conversation with you.
Yeah. Awesome. Me too. Yeah. So let's start off with this question. But what does the word home mean to you? And what are some of the places that you would consider to be home?
Yeah. I love this question. And I've loved it, since kind of realizing in college that it's kind of this, it's a similar question to, where are you from? But it kind of puts the emphasis on like maybe what you value, like, relationships or that sort of thing. And it gives kind of flexibility for people to sort of, where is home for you to change? Home for me right now is kind of equal parts Baltimore, Maryland, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. We went to school together in Chattanooga. So, and my family's been here for a lot of years. Mom and dad originally moved here for school in the 1970s. So even though my family's not originally from Tennessee, it's kind of become an adopted home for us. Baltimore is a little more recent. I moved there in August of 2021 for school and have really fallen in love with it. It's unlike any place I've ever lived. I've never really lived in a big city, and it's, I have a friend from Singapore who moved to Baltimore around the same time as me, and she laughs because Baltimore's not a big city to her.
Right.
But to me it is. And it's my first time living on the East Coast, and it's just, become it's a beautiful place with a lot to offer. So I'd say Baltimore and Chattanooga.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just kind of equal parts Baltimore and Chattanooga. Yeah, that's awesome. Could you tell me a little bit about where you have kind of grown up and a little bit about all the places you've lived?
Yeah. My parents, are expats working in the missionary field. And when I was born, they were living in the UK. In Sheffield, England, and that was sort of where Dad was working out of an office. He was working for this organization that distributed Christian literature and opened Christian bookstores. And so we lived there for about 10 years as a family, but I was born about halfway through in the later 90s. So we left in about 2004, 2005. Mom had been diagnosed with cancer, and just the way things worked out, she was able to get treatment in the U.S. more easily. So we moved back to the U.S., back to Tennessee, and lived in Franklin, Tennessee from about 2006 to 2010, while Mom was undergoing treatment and recovering from her cancer. We had family living nearby Franklin. My grandparents were living in Chattanooga at the time, so those early years were some in England, where I have some memories, and Franklin, Tennessee, and then around 2010 we moved to China. And my parents had been trying to discern like what their calling was, what their sort of next mission field might be. They were both really passionate about missions and knew that they wanted to continue working with, local churches around the world, distributing Christian literature, teaching the Bible. And so probably around 2008, 2009, Dad started making trips to some different countries, including China. And it, for me as a kid, I was, 9 or 10. For me, it was just kind of all a big adventure. It was like, what? We couldn't move to China? And in 2010 we did, in that summer of 2010, and I lived there till about spring of 2017. So from about the ages of 10 to 17. And then I moved back to the U.S. from China in 2017 for school.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So you just kind of talked about, were you born in England or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I was born in Sheffield, England in 1999.
Okay.
And lived there for just about 5 years.
Okay. Yeah. Do you remember much of England at all, or kind of moving back to the States?
Yeah, it's funny having lived in different places. Sometimes our memories of those places are different from, we go back when we're older and it's different from how we remember it.
Yeah.
So I have pretty distinct memories of England, but I don't have a lot of memories. They're kind of snapshots of daily life around the home, which obviously is where I spent, 99% of my time.
Yeah.
And, a nearby park and just kind of the block where we lived, and then some memories of church there. We lived in a big stone house that was close to 300 years old,
Oh, wow.
Slate roof, lead piping, all, the whole package. And, I was the youngest of, growing up there. I probably had 6 or 7 siblings at home. A couple of my older siblings had left for college.
Okay.
When I was, younger, 2 or 3, but it was just fun to grow up in a house with a lot of older siblings.
Yeah.
And, I remember going on walks on the moors, and I remember the night we left, being woken up in the middle of the night and kind of being explained, told, we're moving, we're leaving to the airport now, and they probably had told us before then, but, it's funny, those are just kind of the, snapshots that I remember of, daily life around the home, some around church, going to parks, and then, 1 or 2 distinct memories. And I've been back once.
Okay.
I left when I was about 5 or 6, and I don't remember the exact time of year we left in 2005, so I'm not sure if I was 5 or 6, probably 5. And I went back in June of 2016 with both of my parents to London, and then just my mom to Sheffield.
Okay.
And we stayed with some church friends there. There was a lot of things that I didn't remember, obviously, and, some things weren't the way I remembered. But it was, it was encouraging. There were other things like walking on the moors that this is how I remembered it.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And you talked about being, woken up in the middle of the night and kind of explained that, we're leaving and we're moving, and probably have been told before that, but as a 5-year-old, just kind of that moment just kind of really sticks in your mind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And then coming back to the U.S., you were living in Franklin, that was close to your grandparents, and you were here from when you were 5 until about 10. Is that? Yeah.
So, mom was having her cancer treatment.
Yeah. Sorry, did you, as a 5-year-old, did you understand everything that was going on, or was it just kind of, we're moving back?
Yeah.
For mom being sick? Or? Good
question. I don't remember understanding. I don't remember why we were leaving.
Yeah.
But it also, I didn't really, my life was my family. Right. So for me, personally, it wasn't a big change. It was, I'm with my family, we're going on this trip, and, I'm with my family in the U.S. So I don't remember it being a really shocking change or anything like that. Yeah. I think I have understood more in my teenage years and later than that, just sort of how profound that was for our family.
Yeah.
I certainly didn't understand at the time that mom she was diagnosed at stage 3 breast cancer.
Yeah.
And at the time it was a pretty aggressive form of breast cancer. Now it's highly treatable, but we just weren't sure how long mom was going to live. And I think my parents definitely had to wrestle with that. They didn't know if they had a year or 5 years, and that had a profound impact on my dad.
Yeah.
But I think on all of us, I think it affected all of us. in some way or another. I just at the time didn't realize how, how miraculous it was when Mom was declared cancer free. And that's not how everyone's story ends up.
Yeah.
So that definitely had a big impact on my family, but I personally probably didn't understand the magnitude of it. I do have some distinct memories, though. When Mom lost her hair to chemotherapy, all of us shaved our heads in solidarity. So Peter and I, when we were little, there's a photo of Peter and I, Mom is hugging us, and she doesn't have hair, and then she's got one of us in each arm.
Oh my gosh.
And we were all bald, and we were the Baldy Waldy Club.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
Yeah. That's bringing tears to my eyes.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, it was really tender.
Yeah, that's just a beautiful picture of, I mean, you talked about kind of the importance of your family and just that really feeling like you're moving from England to the US, but that not really being as big of a deal because you were with your family.
Yeah.
Just kind of that picture of your mom going through this really hard thing.
So,
and I mean, did all the kids and your dad just kind of unite with that, or was it you and Peter?
Yeah.
But
I think all of us, to varying degrees, felt the impacts of it. And their stories are their stories, but I could just kind of speak briefly. Dad, during that time, Dad has had some depressive tendencies a lot of his life, and that really hit hard when Mom had cancer. For all he knew, he was going to be a single dad of 9 kids, and I think there were other things that sort of went into that, but Dad's depression was most difficult in those years that Mom had cancer. And so I think that some of my siblings who were teenagers at that time probably felt the impact of that most deeply. And I think that left scars, I'll be honest. I think that both of my parents being so deeply affected and so kind of just so preoccupied with managing cancer and depression and just getting through life, daily life. That I think some of my siblings felt like they were absent in some of those years. And I don't blame them, but I also don't blame my parents. I just think that was a really difficult time for our family.
Yeah.
So, as a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, I missed all that predominantly, really. I think that there's been a lot of healing in the years since, where my siblings have talked through with my parents, about how they felt and have processed through some of that.
Yeah.
But then, one of my sisters was at Covenant College at the time, and I don't know if she was a junior or what, but when Mom, when we found out that Mom had cancer, it was just she just had a really rough time in school. I think for the rest of the year, she just had a really hard time focusing on classes, and probably had to drop some classes and somehow made it to the end of the year. But it was just really tough. It affected her really deeply. So definitely impacted our family a lot, but I personally was just a little too young to feel all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
For sure.
Yeah. And so when your mom, when was she declared free of cancer? Was it at that point that you guys decided to look overseas, or?
Good question. I think she found out she had cancer in 2003 and probably was cancer-free by, or at least in remission by maybe 2007?
Okay.
2007 or 8?
Yeah. Might
have been earlier than that. But I think that for her type of cancer, I might be misremembering the details, but I think there was a chance of remission up to 15 years.
Okay.
And, if it's past 10 or 15 years, they just consider it a new cancer because the chances are so small that remission would happen after that long.
Okay.
So it's been, 18 or 20 years, and so Mom is cancer-free.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so at what point did your dad and your mom, or you guys as a family kind of start looking, because you mentioned your dad started traveling looking for new mission fields?
Yeah.
Or
Probably when Mom had stopped treatment,
Okay.
and was feeling stronger, and I think that Mom actually had a lot of sort of investment in this idea of going overseas and getting back onto the mission field. And so it wasn't just sort of Dad's vision. I think they together prayed about it and worked through that, discerned. Mom also made some trips alone, where Dad was at home with us, and those would usually be like 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And I think that Dad went to a couple of different places. And he ended up, visiting some Christians at working at sort of a cafe, working with student ministry in southern China, and connected with them, and that's where we ended up in southern China in Dali.
In southern China and Dali. How old were you when you guys decided to move over and did move over?
I was 10.
You were 10. Yeah. What? I assume you remember more of that than the transition from
Definitely.
England to the U.S., but could you tell me a little bit about how you experienced that and what that was like?
For me, it was definitely just an adventure.
Yeah.
I think my primary friends were my family.
Yeah.
At the time we were going to a church called Christ Community Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was part of a class there, a Sunday school and a Wednesday nights youth group. But we were 4th, 5th graders,
right?
And I haven't kept up with those guys. I follow some of them on social media, so I it's fun seeing what some of them are up to. And at the time, it was hard because they were my friends. It was hard to say goodbye to that group of friends, but pretty quickly, you find new friends. And I think through all of this, my brother Peter and I have always been really close, and we're kind of the only people for each other that have been through sort of all of life together. Up until now, when we're sort of paths have diverged more since college. Yeah. But it's just been really fun. He got married in November. And I'm getting married next month. Yeah. So it's been kind of fun to I think we're both feeling kind of nostalgic. Just about growing up together. Yeah. And we've always been best buds, and participating in each other's weddings. But through that time moving to China, we really had each other, and I was also close to some of my older siblings. Yeah. So that was kind of, home life for us. I guess once we were in China, it was probably, there were some hard things about those early years. I remember just some interactions with folks living in China, and just kind of thinking, man, like, culture is so different here. Or just kind of having those first impressions.
And I just want to touch on what you just said. Man, the culture's so different here. And I mean, just being 10, 11, 12, 13, did your family have the kind of language to put that together? Or is that something that you've kind of put on later? I think they did have the language. I really do. And I can talk more about my parents. Yeah. Just with their sort of background and upbringing, and maybe this will come out in some of the questions. But Dad grew up himself as an expat in Korea. Okay. So even though both of my parents now are American, and Dad's parents were sort of originally from the Carolinas, and but particularly on his dad's side of the family, they've been in the U.S. for generations, and before that, England.
despite that, like, Dad's family and his parents too were expats. So Dad was born and raised in South Korea for 18 years.
Wow.
So I think with my dad's mom, my dad's mom's side of the family, they were missionaries in China for a lot of years, for a lot of the 1800s and 1900s. And so my grandma grew up in the years around the Cultural Revolution in China. And that's about when, in the 1950s, they moved, 1940s and 50s, they moved to Korea. My dad and his parents and his siblings. So my dad is really, like, he's American, but he's been so deeply impacted by Asian cultures. And I think that really comes out in who he is.
Yeah. Yeah. Just curious, perhaps for my own ignorance, but you talked about being in China during the Cultural Revolution. Could you tell me just a little bit about what that is because I don't know.
Well, I'm not a historian, so I don't know tons about this, but this was around the time when Mao Zedong became, I forget the name of the political title of his political title, but that's when he became, leader of China.
Yeah.
And with a lot of the changes that he brought through the Communist Party, I think there was a lot of hardship in China in the years in the Cultural Revolution. Millions of people starved and just faced other really horrific hardships because of some of the policies that were promoted during those years. And it's I think a really dark period in China's history. And it also came with sort of ramping up of kind of political rivalries between the West and the East around things like communism. So my parents, my dad's parents had to leave in the 50s. I'm not sure exactly when they left, probably at the end of the 40s, early 50s. But they had to leave because they couldn't do the work that they were doing anymore in China. And, that was, a lot about China has changed in the years since then. And in, towards the end of the 20th century, a lot of missionaries were moving back to China and doing more work there. But that was sort of influential in my dad's life because, he really grew up in the southern part of South Korea in Gwangju. And his parents were affected by the Korean War. His dad was a doctor and treated soldiers during the Korean War. And
so that's just kind of a little bit about your dad's story.
And so you had asked whether my parents kind of had the language to process differences in culture when we moved to China. I think probably in the early years of their marriage, my parents didn't really realize how big cultural differences were in their marriage. Dad, like I had explained, really grew up in an Asian context, and even his mom had grown up in an Asian context too. And so they were deeply impacted by Asian culture. And Dad really, if you talk to my dad, he'll tell you that he's like, he's Asian at heart, because that's the cultural context that he relates to most deeply. And it was interesting. It's interesting hearing him tell stories of my parents' years in Europe, because in the 90s and early 2000s, they lived in France and then in England. And those years were hard for him culturally because, England and France were so different from his hard culture. My mom is Dutch. She immigrated with her parents to Wilmington, Delaware when she was a kid. Came over probably in 59, maybe 60. Came on a propellered plane.
Okay.
And my great uncle Peter that who I recently went to visit in Atlanta. He was born in the 1930s. He is my Oma's little brother. Oma is the Dutch word for grandmother. So my mom's mom. Uncle Peter is my Oma's little brother, and he was born in the 1930s. And he came over on like a Swedish freighter. Okay. You know, wow. In the 60s. Wow. So it's just interesting how much travel has changed. Yeah. Mom is really, you know, she's lived in the U.S. since she was 3 or 4 or 5. Yeah. And so she's American now, but she really grew up in a Dutch home. So my mom's heart culture is really from the Netherlands. Yeah. She was born in Heerlen in 1956. And I think in the early years of their marriage, my parents didn't realize that they were in a kind of cross-cultural marriage. Because, you know, they both went to the same school and they were both American at the time. But, you know, really my dad is more Asian and my mom is more European. Yeah. And so as they worked that out in the next couple of decades of their marriage, by the time we moved to China, I think my parents did have a pretty good understanding of, maybe not a complete understanding by any means, but certainly a better understanding of what they were going into. Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, just both on the outside, kind of being like, we're Americans, and then getting married and being like, oh wait, there's a little more here. Yeah, and so you guys all moved to China, and you're kind of living there. Yeah. You know, and you're spending your ages, 10 to 17, 18 until you moved back, which are some pretty transformative years. You know, there's teenage and definitely all of that. But yeah, how has that kind of affected you and impacted you, or how did you experience that? I know that's a very big question, but feel free to take it any which way you want.
No, it's a good question. It was an adventure for me going, and I've learned more about how it impacted me and how it's shaped me in the years since moving back from China. I was homeschooled all the way through, so I was at home a lot. Yeah. So was my brother Peter. My parents worked in student ministry, and so we did have a lot of young Chinese people in our home a lot, and we were pretty involved in the expat community there. So I would say, just generally, to give kind of a sense of how involved I was in the local culture there, and it was I never studied in a Chinese school. And so or an international school for that context, for that matter. The nearest international school was in a city called Kunming, which is the capital city of Yunnan province where I grew up. And Kunming was like, on a good day, 4 hours away by bus from Dali. So, and sometimes up to like 8 hours, just depending on how the roads and traffic were. So, really, if I had gone to that international school, I don't think my parents wanted to put me in a local school. I think they either wanted to homeschool us because they wanted to give us a Christian education, or send us to an international school. And if I had gone to Kunming International Academy, it really would have been like boarding school, basically. I would have lived in Kunming, maybe come home a couple of times a month. And so, that sort of lack of exposure has also shaped how I've been affected, because I wasn't affected as much as, some other expats that I know, some other missionary kids, who've been really deeply shaped. I had a friend who was sort of born and raised in Hong Kong, who, one of my buddies that I grew up with, and he was born and raised in Hong Kong, and then lived in southern China. His family moved to southern China. So really he was, born and raised in Hong Kong and Yunnan. And they went back for furloughs, but he spoke Chinese and, probably identified much more closely with Chinese culture than I did. And, you don't always have the words for that as a teenager. So it was interesting kind of being friends with him, because we always knew that there were sort of differences there. I didn't speak Chinese as well. I understood some and could speak a little, but not as well as he could, And so, let me think for just a sec. Just thinking about how culture shapes us and culture. I think that I personally take after my mom more so than my dad. So I resonate a lot with my mom's home culture. And I can talk a little bit about kind of those cultural differences between the Netherlands and sort of China and what my dad brought.
But before we jump into that, I had a question about, you talked about this friend that kind of grew up in Hong Kong and spoke Chinese fluently, and did he go to a public Chinese school, or?
No, he was also homeschooled, but they lived on a compound where there were also Chinese folks living there, so they had a little bit more of a closer connection.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, and this may resonate, it may not, but do you think if you could go back, would you want to go to an international school or a local Chinese school? Is there a sense of loss
yes.
with kind of,
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. I have learned in the years since that there is that sense of loss for sure.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do both with kind of the opportunity to know a culture deeply and invest in that place deeply, which is something I really long for, where I'm living, to know and invest in a place deeply. And another side of that is just being in school. I loved college and loved that there were team and group things available, like clubs and theater. And I didn't do theater in college, but I just loved that, team sports like ultimate frisbee or pickup soccer. I just loved that there were more group activities available. And that's not really something you get as easily if you're homeschooled. I definitely, growing up, played ultimate frisbee with other kids in my neighborhood and other expats. And but I think that sort of organization is definitely a loss for homeschoolers if you're not involved in a co-op. Is you probably don't get a really robust, an opportunity for like a really robust theater, experience, or a team sport, or that sort of thing. So I feel lost there because I'm much more relationally driven and extroverted. And that's something I've only realized in the last few years. But the other side of that, is definitely not knowing as deeply or being invested as deeply in Chinese culture. I really appreciate and value the choices my parents made around homeschooling us. They had a very clear, clear set of values, and they acted on their values. So I can't fault them for that. I respect them for it. But they valued a Christian education and really wanted to be invested in our lives. So they chose to homeschool us. And I can't say whether I would do the same if I had kids someday. However, they were also really passionate about missions and felt like that was a calling on their lives. They had a pretty unique set of experiences, lived experiences and values and skills that, applied really well to international student ministry. there was also this conversation about identity formation growing up, where I think there was some worry in my parents that if we did go to a Chinese school, or if we did, learn the language fluently, we might struggle more coming back to the U.S. with kind of our identities. And I understand where that perspective comes from. Yeah. I think that I feel a sense of loss around that, because it's part of it is maybe a fear-driven perspective, but also just maybe not as much openness to opportunity and possibility. And as a result, I never learned I never learned Mandarin fluently, and probably did not have as deep or lasting friendships with the local Chinese community as I might have had. But I also don't know how that might have impacted my transition back to the U.S., if I did kind of go all in on connecting with Chinese culture. So, sense of loss is, hit the nail on the head. But, my parents made the choices they made, acting on their values and opportunities, so I respect them for that.
And I mean, that's a choice that all parents make. They do the best that they can with the options that they have, and the children get to live with the consequences and figure it out. And probably have to do the same thing one day when if we have kids.
And it hasn't been as simple and easy as coming to that conclusion. Like I've wrestled with my parents in many respects. To understand their choices and to understand its impact on me. And it wasn't always easy having those conversations. But I think we've worked through it, and I now understand better, even if I haven't always understood, why they made the choices that they did.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Davy.
Yeah, for sure.
It. Yeah. And you talked, backpedaling a little bit, you talked about just talking about your mom's culture and then your dad's culture, and then you come out and you're living in China and what that looks like.
Definitely. Being the youngest of 9 siblings, I'm the youngest of 9. My parents are born in the 50s and sort of on the later end of the boomer generation, so it was common for a lot of younger Christian families in that generation to have a lot of kids. And by the time I came around, I think my parents, probably had a good sense of which parent the kid took after more in sense of just personality. And I definitely take after my mom. And I can explain a little what that means. Dutch culture values industriousness and pragmatism and pride, national pride, and direct communication. And perseverance and these kind of things. The Netherlands was really a country that was kind of a lot of the country was reclaimed from the sea, and they're very proud. The Dutch are very proud of this. They had to, this really ingenious engineering of building dikes and pumping out water and kind of reclaiming land bit by bit from the sea. So there's this saying, God made the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. And it comes out in other sayings too, like, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. It's a little bit more of an abrasive, but it kind of gets the point across. They're proud of who they are. My mom is, very Dutch. She grew up in a Dutch home. Her parents had to, my grandparents, my Opa and Oma, had very strong accents when they spoke in English. And my mom doesn't have an accent, at least not a Dutch one, but does speak a little bit of Dutch. She probably spoke Dutch in the home till she was about 5. And so I think my mom's personality, a little bit more extroverted, a little bit more of a linear thinker, values direct communication, this industriousness and pragmatism, those are values that I think I have really emulate. And some of it's just personality. Not all of it is by choice. And then my dad, growing up in an Asian context, has this immense appreciation for things like filial piety, respect for your parents and honoring your parents and elders, a value on unity and peace, and guanxi, and this sort of like relational interdependence for cooperation and success. These are very much sort of values that my dad's holds, and also this concept of face, which is kind of communicating like honor, I guess. Face is like, it's kind of like someone's reputation. You want to preserve face in yourself and others. So you don't want to say something like rude or really direct and kind of mean to someone, because that could cause them to lose face. There's this kind of, it's very much speaking into this honor shame culture. There are also, I think, some downsides too. Like dad tends to be more indirect, which isn't a downside. It's very subjective, whether or not that's a positive or negative thing. But more of an indirect communicator, a little bit more stoic. And that comes out in the way my parents relate to each other and relate to other people when they have a conflict. Mom wants to get it all out there and resolve it and be direct and just like, she's very much ready to, resolve it. Dad is, it's harder for him. It's harder for him to be direct about the conflict, and he tends to want to sort of take time to let things settle. And so I think there's bits and pieces. I'm more of a direct communicator, but I think that I could talk more about other values like hospitality and relationship. But I think that having, Lewis Coddington is my dad. And growing up in China has given me a really deep appreciation for things like filial piety. Respect for older generations and what they the deep wisdom and experience that they bring, and this valuing of face. And so by personality and disposition, I'm a little bit more Dutch, but I have an appreciation for the way that my dad's culture. I think that there are two. Well, I mentioned hospitality. Talk about it for a minute. I think that my dad is just, having grown up in, an expat community and valuing sort of unity and interdependence, and like just being generous and hospitable to strangers. I think something that I've learned from that kind of culture is and learned about myself actually only recently, maybe in the last year or two, is that I'm very much a maximalist when it comes to relationship. I really buy into this idea, the more the merrier.
Could you, this maximalist term, I haven't heard that before.
Sure.
Could you define that?
It's just the concept, the more the merrier. I very much feel richer extending my table and opening my doors. And it plays out, if Sarah and I are throwing dinner, and we've invited one or two people over and they say, hey, can I bring a friend? We're like, all in, just bring them on over. Like, we'll find food. That's very much for me. I love what that results with,
Yeah.
what that results in. It's just, you see new people meeting each other, and it's just fun, there's the spontaneity, and creating relationship and introducing people to each other is just something I love. And I think that's something that I, maybe appreciate, because it's really who my dad is.
Yeah.
Dad really, loves just, growing up as a kid, sometimes we'd be embarrassed, because Dad literally will talk to anyone. He will go up to, he will look for the person in the room he doesn't know.
Yeah.
And he'll go up to them and just start a conversation.
Yeah.
And ask, who are you? Where are you from?
Yeah.
And he'll just, Dad is just, I've seen only one or two people in my life who just have such a skill for developing instant rapport.
Yeah.
With,
it's a gift.
Total screen. It totally is.
Yeah.
And I've realized that as I've gotten older, it's like, wow, this is such a unique thing about my dad.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. He's introverted.
Yeah.
He's not, all about spending all of his time every day with people.
Right.
But when he does have the opportunity to interact, he's just he's just totally shameless and totally, unfazed by just putting himself out there.
That's so funny, because I'm finding myself just relating to you on the maximalist thing, which I hadn't heard before, and then my dad being embarrassing by talking to anyone. I mean, even the other night, just with the maximalist thing. I mean, you're getting married in a month, so I'm just saying for me with Michelle, I was like, oh, I invited this one friend over, and she's like, okay, and then a couple hours later, I'm like, oh, and by the way, two other people, they got invited, and it's just extended, and Michelle's like, oh, you did what? How many people are coming over? But yeah, that's awesome. That's funny. I found myself relating to you in that sense. That's great. That's
I think too that my social battery's a little higher than Sarah's.
Yeah.
So we've started to run into something similar.
Yeah. Find that balance.
But that, practically, I just I love hospitality.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn this about myself until I moved to Baltimore. And I don't think I learned it about myself, partially because, college was stressful, and I didn't maybe think of myself as having a lot of time and space and energy to be hospitable.
Yeah.
If you're in a dorm living with roommates, it can be, it just plays out differently.
Yeah.
But once I had my own apartment in Baltimore, I learned that I loved having people over to my place. I loved just making tons of food.
Yeah.
Smaller details like, oh, well, we have enough food, or like, oh, they're going to mess up my bathroom or whatever. Just things like that are just so irrelevant to me.
Yeah.
I love being in a space where we have just conversation and people can be relaxed and enjoy each other.
That's awesome.
And I think one of the things that I appreciate so much about Sarah Duke, my fiance, is that she loves hospitality too. And I think another side of this is that I didn't think about whether or not I valued hospitality until I met her. Yeah. And she totally was doing this. She was hosting something called Bread and Butter Social at Covenant when she was a freshman. She would on Saturday nights, she would just bake bread and have friends over.
That's awesome.
And so I began to think about it more and realize that I resonated with that value.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks, Davy. Davy, how have you integrated the culture that you are living in, and with the ones that you have lived in previously, and what it means to be you today?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think living in so many different places with such different values and cultures, from southern China to Tennessee and different parts of Tennessee too. I've spent time in more rural parts of southern Tennessee, and then spent time in Nashville, and even those are different.
Yeah.
And moving to Baltimore, listeners to the podcast will know that I'm not a true Baltimorean because I pronounce it with a hard T instead of Baltimore. And, just as a city on the East Coast and a little bit more north than Tennessee, the values are different. And Baltimore is such a little microcosm of culture and diversity compared with the rest of like Maryland and some of the surrounding states. It's such its own thing and its own culture. It's diverse. There's just this beautiful, rich culture in the arts. Yeah. There's, I think in the city, folks tend to be more progressive, which is true of a lot of big cities around the U.S.
Yeah.
And I've just been surprised again and again by Baltimore, finding like a bluegrass scene in Baltimore really surprised me. Anyway, I think there's an idea that comes up here that's related to the question about integrating culture with where I am, with what feels like home. I think something that I talked about a little earlier with my dad's sort of emphasis on relationship and, relational sort of harmony and cooperation, that for me, and also this kind of idea of honor shame, I think has really translated for me in how people interact with each other and build relationships, and how we think of people who are different from us.
Yeah.
Moving to Baltimore at first was kind of culture shocking. I moved in August of 2021 because I had never lived in a city that big, never lived on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And was just surprised by different aspects of culture there. It's a lot more diverse than Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I think that I learned, both in the way that some folks in Baltimore talk about people outside of Baltimore, but both in the way that people perceive and talk about Baltimore, I learned that we make a lot of assumptions about people who are different from us.
Yeah.
And as I've thought about this more and wrestled more with this over the years, I realized that a lot of the struggle that I had coming back from China in 2017 to the U.S. with relating to folks in my dorm the first year or two, or just relating, to Americans generally, was often about, could have often have been sort of tempered or resolved a little by just recognizing my own assumptions, and the ways that I perceived people around me who were different from me, and the assumptions that I made about them, and, how I valued the differences that they had from me.
Yeah.
And I think that something that I'm really passionate about that's sort of similar to this idea of hospitality is just to be generous about other people, generous in my thinking about other people.
Yeah.
And being conscious of sort of the assumptions and differences that are there in that space. And this really comes out in politics. We talk about, people being on the other side of the aisle with sort of left and right and blue and red. But it also comes out across religious contexts.
Yeah.
Baltimore was, or my primary community in Baltimore was not a Christian community at first, that first year.
Yeah. And
you just see the differences in the values that people have and the way people talk about their experiences and engage with the world.
Yeah.
So something that I've become increasingly passionate about is, or maybe here's a way I can phrase it. When it comes to like conversations about politics, even, sometimes I'm even more passionate about the way people talk about each other and treat each other than about the actual political issues, Yeah. And that comes across, that's true of different conversations too about culture and religion. And I have realized, because, Baltimore has a reputation and the South has a reputation. Folks in Baltimore often talk about Tennessee one way, and people in Tennessee often talk about Baltimore one way. And I guess I've just desire a little bit more self-awareness in how we talk about people who are different from us. And I want that for, like, I am trying to do work to better understand myself and understand people who are different from me and why I might think or feel a certain way. But, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great message. And I love that. It's just kind of, you know, and I mean, even kind of talking about the Christian faith and just kind of the way that we treat people matters, you know, and even believe different things and I just love what you said about, like, when talking about political things, you know, the way that we talk might be more important than, you know, the actual topic itself, and just the way that we relate to other people and all of that. And I just really love what you said there. Yeah,
definitely. It's just become a really important thing to me.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, to wrap up, I have a fun question.
Yeah.
The name of the podcast, Worn Shoes.
Sweet.
What is your most worn pair of shoes? What is your favorite pair of shoes to wear? And I know you're a runner, so, you know, it could be your favorite running shoes or your favorite walking shoes or just lounging shoes.
That's a great question. Something immediately comes to mind.
Okay.
Makes it easy. When my mom's dad, my Opa, he passed away in the late 2000s, 2009 or so, and had a lot of shoes, you know, that he left to my dad. And my dad and I are about the same shoe size. So I got one of my Opa's pairs of shoes. It's these, I think they are Dockers. They're these leather walking shoes. There's nothing super special about them. They don't come up past the heel. They're just a standard leather shoe. Yeah. And they are the most comfortable pair of shoes I have ever worn.
Okay.
And I wore them so much in college that they started to become uncomfortable because of how much sole was worn away. But yeah, true, just like warm shoes for the winter, you know, comfortable walking anytime, anywhere, and kind of fun to have this pair of shoes that I inherited from my grandfather.
Yeah.
And I've looked for the same shoe.
Yeah.
You know, from Dockers and on thrift store websites like Poshmark, and I've just had a hard time finding the same shoe. So can't really replace that. But good question. That's that's what it is for me.
And awesome. As we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to say or just shout out or?
Thanks so much for having me on this podcast. It's a lot of fun to talk more about our upbringing, my upbringing, you know, as an MK expat, and you know, it's a small community. Yeah. And it's fun to hear other people's stories too, whether you're an immigrant or an expat or an international. Just fun to see those stories kind of collected and shared. So pretty enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Davy.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Davy. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to like, follow, and share it on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We do have an Instagram where new episodes and updates will be posted, so check that out. The next episode will be released at the end of March, and it'll have some big updates, so be sure to check that out. Thank you all for your continued support, and tune in next time at The Worn Shoes.